Grab your wine glasses, ladies and gents, because today's video is sponsored by Bright Cellars. They're going to send wine directly to your door. What is better than that? So look, if you're like me, you probably like discovering new wines to drink and enjoy, and that's precisely what Bright Cellars does so well for you. They scour the globe looking for hidden gems across many of the small vineyards that line the Italian countryside or the South American highlands. And Bright Cellars maximizes the chances that you're going to love the wine they send you by providing you with a super short 7-question quiz about what you like. No snobbery, very accessible. And they show you a list of wines from around the world that you're most likely to enjoy based on your responses. When you're done, Bright Cellars sends you your wine with a guarantee that you'll like them, and if you don't, they'll ship you another bottle with your next delivery. So you really can't lose. What else? Well, you could choose how much they sent it, of course. It's all delivered to wherever you want it to go, making everything super easy. Each box is recyclable with a low footprint and features wine education card, so you can learn a bit about what you're drinking, like how it might correctly pair with certain foods or what temperature it's best served at. Brilliant. They also will occasionally do little flash sales. They're very cool. For instance, a couple of months ago, they emailed about a broken label sale where you could grab 12 bottles of wine at a ridiculously low price, all because the labels were a little bit ripped. Okay, no problem. It's still great wine. You guys can get 50% off your first 6-bottle box, which is just $55 for 6 great bottles, which is a crazy good deal. Just follow the link in the description below and get started today. And now today's video. People continue to mature and grow as individuals throughout our lifetimes, at least ideally. So the 45-year-old you would probably not only be better equipped to make decisions than the 25-year-old version, but also in all likelihood be a very different person, both literally in the replacing of your body's physical makeup in that gap, and also mentally. Nevertheless, the 45-year-old version of you and the much less mature and less accomplished 25-year-old version are, in most societies, living under the exact same set of rules and restrictions. So why is some arbitrary number, like 18 or 21, considered the cutoff point when society says everyone should be operating on a level playing field, legally speaking? What is it that makes a person an adult anyway? Is it the ability to drive a car without supervision, consent to intimate relations, ability to cast a vote, serve in the military, buy a beer? And, well, what age is a person really able to handle those responsibilities? These are all really difficult questions that don't lend themselves to easy answers. For example, at just 16 years old, Alexander the Great was busy conquering Media when they dared revolt against Macedonia. And also at 16, a peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc was taking her first steps into historical prominence by having the gall to approach a garrison commander to tell him how to do his job. At 15, one Charles Algernon Parsons was busy inventing the precursor to the modern automobile. At 16, Julius Caesar was heading his family after his father's death. History is littered with individuals accomplishing remarkable adult things, all below the age most countries would today say that they're sufficiently mature enough to be considered an adult. Unsurprisingly, for parts of history, the issue of when someone was ready to take over various adult activities largely fell on a family to decide. Nevertheless, while maturity levels vary greatly from person to person, and the people who know the individual best may be better able to determine things for everyday activities, a number that generally fits everyone is often needed in order to set communal laws. Thus, the age when a person is considered sufficiently able to manage these adult activities and answer for others is typically set by civil policymakers within a nation, and in certain cases, sometimes by each individual state within a country. For example, in California, the age of consent is set at 18, a number largely proliferated by Hollywood and thus often considered the set age of consent in the United States. However, most states actually set it lower, and in many cases, without restriction on age gap between the individuals after that cutoff. The important thing is simply consent. As for a general age for most developed countries of the world, well, they usually consider someone to be an adult rather arbitrarily at the age of 18. Exceptions include countries like Saudi Arabia, where 15 is the age of majority, Cuba, where it's 16, and North Korea, where it's 17. Speaking from a religious standpoint, historically, 13 for males and 12 for females was considered the age of majority in Judaism, essentially aligning with when most said genders would have become reproductively mature, seemingly reflecting that just because someone has become sexually mature doesn't mean they're necessarily mentally mature enough to actually be considered an adult. Most cultures today choose a greater age of majority. Today, we know that the human brain doesn't fully finish developing until closer to one's mid-20s and even potentially into the 30s. Similar to the earlier onset of puberty, the female brain typically finishes its development about 2 years before the male. In fact, the frontal lobe, which is extremely important in our decision-making among other things, including being critical for appreciating future consequences to current actions and inhibiting impulses, isn't finished developing until many years after pretty much every culture in the world considers as you an adult. And speaking of this, neuroscientist Dr. Sandra Amote notes one of the side effects of these changes in the reward system is that adolescents and young adults become much more sensitive to peer pressure than they were earlier or will be as adults. So for instance, a 20-year-old is 50% more likely to do something risky if two friends are watching than if he's alone. So today, if we were most concerned about one's mental maturity via underlying physical brain development being maximized before considering someone an adult, we might set that number at around 25 to 30 years old. But long before 25, most are sufficiently mentally mature enough to have enough base knowledge and experience to be out there on their own in the world, even if they're more susceptible to making poor decisions for themselves than they will be a few years later. This is likely why few have any problem with setting the number at something like 18 or 21. As for how that specific number was reached, well, mostly arbitrarily. For instance, the United States has long borrowed its original age of majority from British common law, which was set at 21 to quote, "By the common law, the age of majority is fixed at 21 years for both sexes, and in the absence of any statute to the contrary, every person under that age, whether male or female, is an infant." Why this was the British common law age isn't fully clear. One claim is that it's derived from when squires could become knights. However, if this is true, this seems more of a corollary rather than a derivation, in that it is essentially when the squires were considered adults. On top of that, there are certainly many known exceptions where individuals were considered knights before this age. It would seem more likely this was simply the age around which it was generally observed that people started to reach sufficient enough mental maturity to no longer need any type of direct supervision. It should be noted that it's only been an extremely recent phenomenon that the age of majority was given much credence to in many legal scenarios. For instance, historically, teenagers could and sometimes were members of British Parliament, and even exceptionally young children around kindergarten age today could sign contracts that were legally binding, such as contracts that compelled them to work for some individual or business, even into adulthood. Children could also be executed or face other extremely serious consequences for crimes they committed. After the initial adoption of 21 years old in the United States, the age of majority waffled over the decades, varying from activity to activity and state to state. For instance, on a national level, prior to 1971, the voting age was still 21, but then it was lowered to age 18 by the 26th Amendment. So what spurred the change, and why 18? As for the number, this seemingly was at least partially chosen because that's the age when most people graduated high school, and the majority of people in the United States attended such a public institution when the switch was made. As for why the age was changed at all, the reasons behind this include massive improvements in public education since the 21 number was originally set, as well as recognition that 18-year-olds are able to enter into legally binding contracts, as well as get married, have children, and even be forcibly drafted. The latter point was critical to the change, as 18-year-old males at this time could be forced to fight in a war but had no say in whether their country went to war in the first place. This was a particularly hot topic in the Vietnam War era, where many youth strongly opposed the war, and those politicians who felt likewise were keen on getting those young people the ability to vote. In the contemporary words of Senator Edward Kennedy, "First, our young people today are far better equipped intellectually, physically, and emotionally to make the type of choices involved in voting than were past generations of youth." Many experts believe that today's 18-year-old is at least the equal physically and mentally of a 21-year-old of his father's generation, or a 25-year-old of his grandfather's generation. The contrast is clear in the case of education. In 1920, just 50 years ago, only 17% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 21 were high school graduates. Only 8% went on to college. Today, by contrast, 79% of Americans in this group are high school graduates, and 47% go on to college. Because of the enormous impact of modern communications, especially television, our youth are extremely well informed on all the crucial issues of our time, foreign and domestic, national and local, urban and rural. Our 18-year-olds today are a great deal more mature and more sophisticated than former generations at the same stage of development. Their role in issues like civil rights, Vietnam, and the environment is as current as today's headlines. Through their active social involvement and their participation programs like the Peace Corps and Vista, our youth have taken the lead on many important questions at home and overseas. In hundreds of respects, they have set a far-reaching example of insight and commitment for us to emulate. Second, by lowering the voting age to 18, we will encourage civic responsibility at an earlier age and thereby promote lasting social involvement and political participation for our youth. The amendment was passed with overwhelming support under the slogan, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. On the other hand, also in the 1970s, several states raised their minimum legal drinking ages above 18. This culminated in the National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984, which penalized states for allowing people under 21 to purchase and publicly have alcohol. Apparently old enough to kill for one's country, but not old enough to imbibe. In truth, overconsumption of alcohol has potentially much more detrimental effects on developing brains than matured ones, and perhaps further reflecting the aforementioned research on physical brain development well beyond 18, particularly with regard to decision-making, the switch from 18 to 21 on the legal drinking age was credited with reducing traffic fatalities by 20% shortly after the law was changed. Of other developed countries, however, only South Korea, Japan, and Iceland also have a drinking age over 18, and their older teams seem to handle it fine. As for age of consent in the Western world, and generally speaking, before Imperial Rome, girls were deemed sufficiently sexually mature for marriage and sex when they first started menstruation, and boys, by the way, when they developed pubic hair. But note, as with some of the later laws that we're going to talk about, this had much more to do with guidelines around marriage rather than actually receiving anyone's literal consent for sex. In addition, marriage was relatively unregulated by the state then, and instead was largely seen as a private family matter, so it is presumed these boundaries were flexible. Moving on, the Catholic Church had rules for just about everything during the Middle Ages, and one of its most authoritative texts was the Decretum Gratiani, written by the jurist Johannes Gratian in the 12th century. It set a minimum age for betrothal, not necessarily marriage, at 7 years for boys and girls, and the lawful age for women to consent to marriage and so-called carnal intercourse at 12, although certain unusual circumstances would render marriages at younger ages valid as well. Essentially, the general opinion through much of human history was that at around the age humans become sexually mature, at least speaking reproductively, as with animals, they didn't see any point in restricting people from marrying and reproducing. All that said, while these numbers are shockingly low by our modern sensibilities, contrary to popular belief, it has never really been the norm for such young individuals to get married, not even concerning women. For example, in Massachusetts, records dating from 1652 to 1800 demonstrate that the average age of first marriage for ladies was between 19.5 and 22.5 years, and records for other colonies reflect similar ages. In fact, the average age of first marriage for all of the colonies studied was 19.8 before 1700, 21.2 during the early 18th century, and 22.7 during the late 18th century. Data gathered in England, France, and Germany puts the average age of first marriage for women at a whopping 25.1 from 1750 to 1799 and 25.7 from 1800 to 1849. By the end of the 19th century, the average age when women were first getting married in the United States was between 22 and 24 years old, and this trend continued into the 1940s. Surprisingly, the lowest average age of first marriage since the early 1700s was had by the baby boomer generation, where the age dropped to 20.5 years. It is perhaps not coincidental that divorce rates peaked in the United States around the 1970s and early 1980s and have been in strong decline ever since, almost in lockstep with the average age of first marriage increasing. The more mature you are and the more you know yourself and where you're going in life, in the aggregate, the better decision you'll probably make in choosing a life partner. In any event, while one might technically be able to reproduce at ages around 12, occasional exploitation of such young individuals eventually spurred changes in the laws. As such, over centuries, this age has gradually increased in most regions of the world. However, even today, in some developed countries, the age to consent to sex remains below 16. In others, there is something of a sliding scale. In the United States, it's deemed Romeo and Juliet laws. In these, it's generally said that as long as two people are within a certain age span of one another, it is legal for them to have consensual sex. For example, in Washington state, it's legal for a person as young as 11 to have consensual sex as long as the person they're having sex with is at least 11 and not more than 2 years older than themselves. If even one day outside of those 2 years, it's illegal, and the older individual faces exceptionally stiff penalties, including up to life in prison in some cases. Moving up the sliding scale, minors who are 12 and 13 are legally allowed to have consensual sex with someone as much as 3 years older than themselves, and 14 to 15-year-olds with someone who is no more than 4 years older than themselves. Opponents of such systems argue that individuals that young can never actually give consent, as they're relatively easily coerced, not mentally mature enough to fully appreciate and factor in the potential ramifications of such acts, i.e. potential children and disease resulting from the act, a position our current knowledge of brain development at least partially supports. On the other hand, proponents of these types of laws and keeping the age of consent relatively low cite recognition that teenagers will frequently engage in consensual intimate activities with other teens, whether legal in their particular region or not. not. So potentially sending them to jail under some of the harshest penalties most legal systems have to offer for having consensual sex is absurd, particularly given that potential coercion from people far older, which is largely what originally spurred increases in age of consent, is comparatively rare and in many cases would already be illegal anyway under separate laws. On that note, in most jurisdictions, if two people are legally married, age of consent laws aren't usually applied at all. In the end, beyond people maturing at different rates, even deciding what makes a person an adult at all is an amazingly complex question, let alone trying to decide a hard number where the transition takes place in general and what activities should be restricted only to people who've passed this point in age. But given the necessity to have a number for certain laws, in recognition that a poor decision in one's youth shouldn't necessarily ruin one's entire life, and children need certain extra protections and restrictions, most governments see fit to come up with hard numbers. Unsurprisingly, given the complexity of the issues involved, while there is some loose rationale behind the numbers, they have, on the whole, been set somewhat arbitrarily. So, why are you considered an adult in most of the world when you hit 18? To sum up, people have long seemed to figure this was around the age when most humans reach a level of maturity and base knowledge to be fully responsible for themselves and their own actions, even if said individuals will be far more mature and better equipped to handle the challenges of adulthood even just a decade later. That will always be true, no matter what age you are, if you're continually improving yourself. But a baseline was needed, so a number was picked for certain official purposes, even if it isn't perfectly ideal in all cases.